The morning the snow stopped falling, Seth Reed stood at the frost-laced window of his ranch house and watched Nora Bailey walk toward the barn with a pail of feed in each hand, her dark hair loose and wild around her shoulders, and something cracked open in his chest so violently that he pressed his palm flat against the cold glass just to feel something solid. She was supposed to be gone by now. That was the agreement. That had always been the agreement. She had come to Harlan County, Wyoming Territory, in the first week of November 1882 because her wagon had broken an axle 2 miles east of his property line, and the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 40 minutes. She had knocked on his door with frostbitten fingers, and a set to her jaw that told him she would sooner sleep in a snowdrift than beg. He had let her in because he was not a monster, and the blizzard had sealed them both inside for 11 days, 11 days that had rearranged every wall he had ever built around himself without his permission. And now the snow had cleared. And Seth Reed, who had told himself every single one of those 11 days that he did not need anyone, that he was finished with needing anyone, stood at his window unable to picture a morning without her in it. But that was not the thing that had cracked him open. The thing that had cracked him open was the letter he held in his other hand, the one he had found tucked behind the flour sack in the kitchen at dawn, written in her clean, careful handwriting, placed there like a confession she could not make to his face. The letter that told him exactly who Nora Bailey really was. The letter that told him why she had really come to Wyoming. And why, if she had any sense left, she would be leaving before nightfall. He read the first line again, his jaw locked so hard it ached. Seth, there are things I should have told you the night I came to your door, and I am a coward for not having told them sooner. He folded the letter, pressed it against his sternum, watched her set down one pail and use her free hand to push her hair out of her face, and the gesture was so familiar to him now, so hers, that it felt like a blade between his ribs. He had to know all of it, every hidden word, every secret she had carried through that blizzard and warmed herself beside his fire with. He went to the door and he opened it, and the cold air hit him like a fist. "Nora," he called out across the yard, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. She turned, and when her eyes found his, and when she saw what was in his face, she went very still in the way a person goes still when they have been waiting a long time for the moment they most dread. He held up the letter. And that was where everything between them began to either break or build itself into something neither of them had ever had the courage to believe in. 3 weeks earlier, Nora Bailey had been standing at the edge of a dirt road outside Cheyenne with all of her earthly possessions loaded into a hired wagon, and a one-way ticket to a new life folded inside the pocket of her coat. She was 26 years old. She had copper-brown hair that refused to behave and gray eyes that her mother had always said looked like rain about to happen, which had never struck Nora as a compliment until she was old enough to understand that rain was necessary. She had a schoolteacher's mind, precise and organized, and a restlessness in her bones that had never once quieted no matter how many towns she had lived in or left behind. She had grown up in Ohio, in a household that ran on rigidity and expectation. Her father, Edmund Bailey, had been a respected attorney with a talent for appearing decent in public, and a separate set of qualities he reserved for private use. He was not a cruel man in the way that left marks. He was cruel in the way that left nothing at all, a hollow where warmth should have been, a silence where encouragement might have lived. Nora had spent her childhood performing the role of dutiful daughter well enough to satisfy appearances, while quietly building an interior life entirely her own. She had taught school in Columbus for 4 years after her training. She had been good at it, patient with the slow learners and careful not to let the bright ones grow bored, and she had loved the smell of chalk dust and the particular satisfaction of watching a child's face change when something finally made sense. But the schoolhouse in Columbus had been run by a board of men who had never once set foot inside a classroom, and when one of those men, a Mr. Gerald Cook, had begun making it very clear that his patronage of the school came with expectations of a personal nature. Nora had done the thing that had defined her character her whole life. She had refused, loudly, in writing, with copies sent to 2 newspapers. The result had been what results were always going to be for a woman in 1882 who embarrassed the wrong man. She had lost her position. She had lost her rented room because the landlady's husband sat on that same school board. She had found, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the life she had built in Columbus had rested on foundations she had not understood were borrowed. She was not broken by it. She was furious. And fury, in Nora Bailey, had always been a productive force. A woman she had known slightly, a former colleague named Martha Haynes, who had married a rancher in Wyoming territory and moved west 2 years prior, had written her a letter in the spring of 1882. Martha's letter had been full of the rugged, inconvenient, extraordinary details of a life that was genuinely hers, a life built with her own hands in country so vast it could swallow your old self and let a new one emerge. Martha had mentioned, almost in passing, that the territory was crying out for educated women, that several small settlement communities were forming and desperately needed teachers, and that if Nora ever wanted to come out and see it for herself, there was a spare room and a welcome in it. Nora had written back in September. She had packed in October. She had left Ohio in the first week of November with everything that mattered to her, which turned out to fit into 2 large trunks and a leather satchel. The wagon she hired outside Cheyenne was driven by a man named Cletus Briggs, 60-something, leather-faced, with a white mustache and a philosophy of life that could be summarized as, "Things generally work out if you keep moving." He had been cheerful company for the first day and a half and had charged her a fair price. What neither of them had accounted for was the state of the road east of Harlan, which had been soft from October rains and had frozen unevenly, and had been waiting for exactly the wrong wheel to hit exactly the wrong frozen rut at exactly the wrong angle. The axle snapped at 3:30 in the afternoon on November 4th. Cletus got down, examined the damage with the calm of a man who had seen worse, and told her with genuine regret that the axle was beyond roadside repair, and that he would need to ride ahead to Harlan to arrange for another vehicle, and that it would take him until morning. He had offered to stay with her, but she could see on his face that staying was going to cost him something he could not easily afford, and she had waved him off. She was not afraid of the dark. She had not counted on the sky turning that particular shade of greenish-purple that experienced plains people recognized as the signature of a serious storm front. She had not counted on the temperature, which had been brisk and manageable at 3 in the afternoon, dropping so savagely that by 4:30 she could no longer feel her fingers properly. She had wrapped herself in every layer she owned, which was considerable, but the wind that came in with that front was a different kind of cold than any she had known in Ohio. It was not cold that settled. It was cold that hunted. She had grabbed her satchel, the one with her most important documents and her small amount of money, and she had walked east because she had seen, from the wagon seat, what she thought might be a structure set back from the road about a half-mile. She had been right. It was a ranch, a serious and well-maintained one, with a house built from good timber and a barn large enough to represent real investment, and a fence line that spoke of someone who intended to be here permanently. The man who opened the door had looked at her the way people look at something they were not expecting and are not sure what to do with. He was tall, not in the theatrical way of men who know they are tall and use it. In the practical way, like he had grown to whatever height the work required and had not thought about it since. He had dark eyes under a heavy brow, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for so long it had forgotten how to unset, and hands that were scarred and roughened in the specific way of someone who worked land alone without enough help. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his early 30s, perhaps 32 or 33, though the particular quality of his quietness made him seem both older and younger than whatever his actual age was. He had not said a word when she appeared at his door. He had simply looked at her, read the situation, looked past her at the sky, and stepped back to let her in. His name, she had learned from the hand-lettered sign above the barn when she arrived, was Seth Reed. Inside, his house was spare but not poor. There was a good iron stove already going, a table with 2 chairs, a set of shelves with books that surprised her, a braided rug that was worn thin in the middle, and everywhere the feeling of a place that had been built with care and then lived in alone for long enough that the care had started to go quiet. He had given her dry blankets and moved a chair close to the stove without being asked. He had put water on to heat. He had done all of this without unnecessary words, and she had been too cold and too tired to find his silence anything but restful. The blizzard had begun in earnest within an hour of her arrival. It was not a polite storm. Wyoming territory in November of 1882 was not in the habit of politeness. It came in sideways and white and absolute, and within 2 hours the visibility was so complete a zero that you could not have found the barn if you had not already memorized the precise number of steps between the porch and the door. The temperature outside fell to something that made the inside feel, despite the stove, like a struggle rather than a comfort. Seth Reed had moved through his own house with the contained efficiency of a man who had long practiced handling things alone. He had brought in more wood. He had checked and rechecked the stove damper. He had fed his animals at dusk by rope line, a length of rope tied between porch post and barn door, and come back inside with snow packed into every crease of his coat and his face red and tight with cold. Nora had made the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. He had stopped in the kitchen doorway when he came in and found her at his stove with his coffee pot, and had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read. "I hope that's all right," she had said. "It's fine," he had said, and his voice was low and even and had a particular resonance to it, like a note struck on a well-tuned instrument. They had drunk the coffee at the table, and the storm had screamed outside the walls, and Seth Reed had told her, in the fewest possible words, that the storm would likely run 2 or 3 days and that she was welcome to stay. He said it in the tone of a man stating a practical fact, not making an offer he expected gratitude for. She had understood from that tone that he was not a man who wanted thanks and would be uncomfortable receiving it. She had said, "Thank you, Mr. Reed," because her own mother had raised her with manners even if not with warmth. He had nodded and said, "Seth," and that had been that. She slept in his bed that first night because he insisted, quietly and without discussion, that she take it, and he had slept on the floor by the stove wrapped in a buffalo robe that had clearly served this purpose before. She had lain in his bed and listened to the blizzard press itself against the walls like something alive and determined, and she had felt, beneath the cold and the disorientation and the uncertainty, something strange and unwelcome and honest. She had felt safe. It had unsettled her completely. On the second day they were still sealed in. The snow was coming down in a way that made the outdoors look like a solid white wall, and the wind had a voice that rose and fell with the rhythm of something in genuine distress. Seth had gone out at dawn on his rope line to tend the animals and come back in moving stiffly, and Nora had without asking put another log in the stove and had the coffee ready before he got his coat off. He had stopped again in that doorway. She was beginning to understand that the doorway was where he processed things. They had talked that day. Not easily at first, not in the way of people who are comfortable with each other, but in the way of 2 people who have nothing to do except be in the same room and who are not willing to be dishonest about that. He had answered her questions about the ranch in the compressed, informative way of a man who respected precise information. He ran cattle, 240 head at last count, with the help of 2 ranch hands who had gone into Harlan for supplies the week before and been prevented from returning by the first minor snow of the season. He had been running this ranch for 6 years, had bought the land himself from the Territorial Land Office in 1876, and had built the house in the first winter working mostly alone. "Why Wyoming?" she had asked. He had looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "I needed somewhere that was mine." She had understood that completely. She had not said so yet. He asked where she was going, and she told him about Martha Haynes and the teaching position and the fresh start. And he listened with the focused attention of a person who does not perform listening but actually does it. When she finished, he nodded and said, "Good country for a fresh start," which struck her as the most personal thing he had said so far, and she filed it away with the instinct of a woman who has learned to read what people mean rather than only what they say. On the third day, with the blizzard showing no signs of relenting, she found his books. He had 24 volumes on the shelf beside the window, an eclectic and revealing collection. There was a battered copy of Thoreau's Walden, which she had read and loved. There was a surveying manual. There was a thick volume on cattle husbandry that looked extremely well used. There was Dickens' Oliver Twist, with a spine so creased it had clearly been read multiple times. There was a thin volume of Tennyson. There was a book on the history of the Wyoming Territory that was more honest about the displacement of the Shoshone and Arapaho peoples than most such books chose to be. And she noted that several passages were marked with small pencil notations in the margin that showed someone reading critically rather than passively. She had taken down the Tennyson because it was unexpected, and because she wanted to see what he would say. He had come in from checking on the animals to find her reading it and had gone still for just a moment, a fraction of a second, before going to the stove. "You marked this one," she said, showing him the page, "The Lady of Shalott." He set the coffee pot down with deliberate care. "The copy was already marked when I got it." "You bought a marked copy?" A pause. "At a trading post outside Laramie. The man selling it needed the money more than the sentiment. And you've read it enough times that the spine tells a different story than that one." He turned then and looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was neither caution nor blankness. Something wry and self-aware, and beneath that undefended. "It's a good poem," he said. "It is," she agreed. "She weaves a web to keep herself from the world, and it destroys her anyway." "Some people think she chose the wrong moment to look directly at it," he said. "Some people," said Nora, "are wrong." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It lasted less than a second, but it was real. That was the moment she would think later. That was the moment the thing between them became a thing. They cooked together that evening, a task made companionable by the close quarters of his small kitchen, and by the fact that they both had strong opinions about how to make a proper stew. He won the argument about the amount of salt. She won the argument about how long to let it simmer. The stew was the best either of them had eaten in longer than they would admit. On the fourth day, the storm was still absolute, and Nora began to understand that 11 days alone together in a small house would either make them deeply uncomfortable with each other or something else entirely. She chose, as she generally did in situations of uncertain social terrain, to simply be honest. "I'm not a difficult person to be around," she said at breakfast. "But I do talk too much when I'm confined, and I have opinions about nearly everything, and I think you should know that up front so you can tell me to be quiet when you need quiet." He had looked at her over his coffee with those dark eyes that were starting to be familiar to her. "I'll tell you," he said simply. He never did. She talked. About Ohio and the school and what had happened with Gerald Cook, which she told without self-pity and without excessive detail. Just the facts of it and what they had meant for her options. He listened with the focused attention she had already catalogued as his particular quality, and when she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "He was a coward," Seth said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "Men like that use their positions because they don't have anything else." "That was my conclusion also," said Nora. He looked at the table. "You were right to leave." She had not asked for that validation and did not need it, but the fact that he offered it without being asked, and in that particular tone, meant more to her than it should have. She asked him about his past. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer, and she was already constructing the graceful redirect in her mind when he said, "I grew up in Missouri. My father ran a ferry crossing. He was a hard man." She waited. "I left when I was 19, worked on drives 2 years up the Kishom Trail, 1 year in Colorado, then came north, worked on other men's ranches for 5 years before I had enough to buy this land. And no family since then." The pause this time was different. It had an edge to it. "There was a woman," he said, "in Colorado, 1878. She died in a fever outbreak in August of that year." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." Her name was Clara. "She must have been remarkable if you're still carrying her this carefully." He looked up then, and there was something in his face that she had not expected to put there, and she held very still, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening behind his eyes. "She was kind," he said, "just straightforwardly kind. It was the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen in a person." Nora said nothing. She was thinking about kindness and about the particular courage it takes to be straightforwardly kind in a world that tends to punish it. On the 5th day, a section of the barn roof cracked under the weight of accumulated snow, and Seth went out in conditions that she could only describe as dangerous, and spent 4 hours in the cold nailing boards across the breach. She stood at the window and watched the rope line occasionally snap taut in the wind, and felt a fear that was both practical and personal. When he came back inside, his hands were so cold he could not grip the door latch, and she had to open it from her side. And she had taken his hands between hers and held them until the circulation returned, and neither of them had said a word about the fact that she was holding his hands, or about the way his fingers eventually closed around hers. On the 6th day she found his ledger. She had not been snooping. She had been looking for something to read, and had picked up what she thought was a blank journal, and opened it to find the meticulous financial records of a man managing a ranch that was under significant pressure. She understood figures, and she understood enough of frontier economics from Martha's letters to read what she was looking at. The drought of the previous summer had cut his hay yield substantially. He had bought supplemental feed at elevated prices. His cattle count was down from the year before due to a difficult calving season. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were serious, and the handwriting in the margins told the story of a man making constant small calculations about how to stay viable. She had been putting the ledger back when he came in and saw her holding it. She expected irritation. What she got was something closer to resignation. "The numbers aren't good," she said directly, because she respected him enough not to pretend she hadn't seen it. "They've been worse," he said. "Have they?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "No, but they've been closer to as bad." She set the ledger carefully on the table. "I know something about figures. I kept the accounts for the school in Columbus for 3 years after the previous bookkeeper took a different position. If you want a second set of eyes at any point, the offer stands." He looked at the ledger and then at her, and then at a point somewhere past both of them where she suspected he was working through several things simultaneously. "All right," he said at last. They spent that evening going through the ledger together. She found 2 calculation errors in his favor and 1 recurring overcharge from his feed supplier that, once identified, represented a meaningful amount of money over a year. He sat very still when she showed him the 3rd one. Then he reached for a pencil and made a note and said, "I'll deal with that when the thaw comes," in a tone that suggested the feed supplier was going to have a very specific conversation in the near future. Nora felt the particular satisfaction of being useful in a precise and needed way. She also felt something else, something she chose not to examine closely yet. On the 7th day, she found the hidden motive she had been carrying. She had known, from the moment she was sealed into this house by the blizzard, that it would come out eventually. She was not a woman built for long deceptions. The problem was that the thing she was carrying was not a simple thing, and every day that passed in which Seth Reed proved himself to be more than she had expected made it harder to say. She had come to Wyoming territory not only for the teaching position in Martha Haynes's settlement. She had come because of a man named Douglas Vane. Douglas Vane was a land speculator operating out of Cheyenne in the autumn of 1882, a man of substantial financial resources and no discernible conscience who had been systematically acquiring ranch land in Harlan County through a combination of loan pressure, forged documents, and intimidation. Nora knew about Douglas Vane because her former employer in Columbus, the school board that had dismissed her, had a financial connection to Vane's Eastern Investment Group through Gerald Cook, and she had, before leaving Ohio, made it her business to understand exactly who and what she was up against in case she ever needed leverage. She had not intended to do anything with this information when she left Ohio. She had intended to go to Wyoming, teach school, build her life, and leave the rotten business of Douglas Vane and Gerald Cook to whatever reckoning eventually found men like that. But when Martha had written her in September, she had mentioned, among other things, that a rancher named Seth Reed in Harlan County had recently received what she described as an ugly letter from some Cheyenne money man trying to force him to sell. Martha had not known she was telling Nora anything of significance. Nora had known immediately. The documents she carried in her satchel, the ones she had described to herself as her most important possessions, were not personal papers. They were copies, obtained through contacts in Columbus with access to court filings, of the fraudulent land transfer instruments that Vane had used in 3 previous acquisitions in Wyoming territory. They were evidence, not the kind that would stand immediately in a court of law, but the kind that, in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, could create enough noise and scrutiny to stop a predatory scheme in its tracks. She had come with the intention of finding a way to get these documents to Seth Reed. She had not counted on Seth Reed being the kind of man he was. She had expected to find a beleaguered rancher grateful for outside assistance. She had found instead a man so fully himself, so quietly and thoroughly his own person, that the idea of walking up to him and saying, "Here are some documents that might save your ranch. I've been carrying them since Ohio," felt not like the helpful gesture she had framed it as but like a manipulation, like she had arrived at his door under false pretenses, like she had known something about him before she met him that he had not had the chance to know about her. The longer she stayed, the darker this felt. On the 8th day, she told herself she would tell him on the 9th. On the 9th day, she told herself the 10th. On the 10th day, she nearly told him at the dinner table and lost her nerve at the last moment, which was not a thing Nora Bailey generally did, and which told her exactly how much she had come to care what this man thought of her. On the 11th day, the morning of it, she had written the letter. She had put it behind the flour sack where she knew he would find it because he baked bread every other day, and today was a bread day. She had written everything in it: Douglas Vane, the documents, the connection to Cook, the reason she had come, and the fact that she had stayed not because of the blizzard alone but because 11 days in this house with this man had done something to her that she had not been prepared for and could not honestly claim was separate from who she now was. She had written, at the end, "I know this may look like a trap or a hidden motive that changes what these days have been. I can only tell you that what I brought with me were documents. What I found here I did not bring and did not plan for. I am sorry for the one and grateful beyond my capacity to express it for the other." Then she had gone to the barn to feed the animals because she needed air and because she could not sit in the house and wait for him to find it. Seth stood in the yard with the letter in his hand, and the cold settling back into the air in the particular clean way it does after a blizzard passes, and he watched Nora turn to face him and go still, and the thing he felt was not what he had braced for. He had braced for betrayal. He had lived through enough hidden motives, enough dark pasts revealed at inconvenient moments, enough of the particular sick feeling that comes with finding out a person was not the thing you thought, that he had spent the entire walk between the window and the door preparing for rage. The rage was there, a version of it, but it was quieter than expected, and beneath it was something else, something that in its stubbornness refused to let the rage be the whole story, because he had read the letter twice, the whole letter. And the documents she described were real. He could feel their realness in the specificity of what she wrote. And what they contained was the proof he had been trying to find for 3 months, the months since Douglas Vane's man had shown up at his gate with a friendly offer that had the texture of a threat. Seth had known something was wrong. He had known it in the specific, livestock smell way that told you when the weather was turning. But knowing something is wrong and being able to prove it are different countries, and he had been stuck at the border. And Nora Bailey had walked through a blizzard with the border crossing in her satchel. That was the part the rage could not account for. She had not used the documents. She had not said, "Here is what I have, now owe me." She had spent 11 days being exactly herself, no more and no less, and she had put the truth in a letter and behind a flour sack because she could not look him in the face and do it. That was not the behavior of someone running a scheme. That was the behavior of someone who cared too much to be strategic about it. He walked across the yard. The snow crunched under his boots with the particular clean sound of a freeze that has gone deep. She watched him come and did not move and did not look away. He stopped 2 feet from her. "You came for my ranch," he said, not as an accusation, as a statement. "I came to bring you documents that could protect your ranch," she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. "Those are not the same thing. Close enough to the same thing that you couldn't tell me for 11 days. "Yes," she said, "because it stopped being about documents around day 3 and I didn't know how to separate one from the other." He was quiet. The wind moved her hair across her face and she did not push it back this time. She kept her eyes on his. "You have a connection to Vane," he said, "to the man in Ohio who is connected to Vane's Eastern investors, Gerald Cook. He had me fired because I refused to cooperate with his expectations. He's a coward with financial ties to a worse man. And the documents you're carrying are copies of forged transfer instruments from 3 previous Vane acquisitions in the territory. They're not a courtroom case on their own, but they're enough to bring scrutiny from the Territorial Land Office and potentially from federal investigators if the right people see them." He looked at her for a long time. "How did you get them?" "I asked the right person in Columbus who had access to the right court filing office, and I paid them $10, and I carried them in my satchel for 600 miles. Something shifted in his face, not the softening she might have hoped for, something more interesting than that, something that looked almost like recognition. "Why?" he said. She had known this question was coming and she had prepared for it, and all her preparation went out like a candle in the wind the moment he said it, because the honest answer, which was the only answer she knew how to give, was the one that made her most vulnerable. "Because I was angry," she said, "at first. Men like Cook and Vane are the same kind of animal, and they keep winning because the people they hurt don't have what they need to fight back. I had something they needed and I was going west anyway, and it seemed like the right thing to do. And now, the morning air was cold and clear, and she could see the mountains to the west like a rampart, and she could see the ranch as she had come to know it over 11 days, the careful fences, the well-built house, the barn with its new boards nailed over the storm break. Now I am standing in the snow hoping that you believe me when I tell you that I regret not saying this on the first night, and that everything else about these 11 days was real, and that I would like very much not to leave today." Seth Reed looked at the woman in front of him and took his time about it. He was 33 years old, a man who had spent his adult life in deliberate service to the single goal of building something that was his, something solid and permanent that no one could take from him. He had loved one woman and lost her to a fever, and had sealed himself behind the loss with the efficiency of someone boarding up windows before a storm, and had told himself with increasing conviction that the sealed state was preferable to the exposed one. 11 days had dismantled this argument so thoroughly that he could not locate the pieces. She had argued with him about Stu, and she had found errors in his ledger, and she had read his Tennyson, and said the thing about the Lady of Shalott that had been sitting in his chest since she said it. She had not asked for his sympathy when she told him about what happened in Ohio, and she had not offered him false comfort when he told her about Clara. She had gone to his barn every morning to help with the animals because she could not sit still in a crisis, even someone else's crisis, even a crisis made up entirely of weather. And she had written him a letter and put it behind a flour sack because she was, beneath the competence and the directness and the opinions about nearly everything, afraid of what he would think of her. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. "Show me the documents," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment, reading him. Then she nodded and went to the house. He followed her. They spread the documents on the table in his kitchen, and he looked at them with the focus he gave to everything that mattered, which was the same focus he gave to everything. She explained what each instrument represented, which transfers had been forged, which names were falsified, and how the pattern connected. She was precise and organized and did not embellish. He had a naturally analytical mind, and he had spent the past 3 months trying to understand what Douglas Vane was doing and why, and the documents filled the gaps in his understanding with a precision that was almost satisfying if it had not also been maddening. When she finished, he sat back in his chair. "There's a federal land office inspector named Charles Pratt based in Laramie," he said. "I've corresponded with him about the water rights dispute I had 2 years ago. He's one of the few men in that office who actually does his job. If you send him these copies with a detailed letter and CC the territorial governor's office," said Nora, "you create a record that's difficult to bury. I need to ride to Harlan first and file a formal complaint with the county recorder. Creates a dated legal record before Vane's men have any idea this is coming. How long to Harlan? 2 hours in good conditions. The road will be rough after the storm, but the snow looks firm enough to travel." She was quiet for a moment. "I could draft the letter to Pratt. I know how to write a document that cannot be ignored." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in the look that was different from anything that had come before. It was not the carefully neutral assessment he had offered her at the beginning. It was not the wary interest of the middle days. It was direct and unguarded and named something. "All right," he said. She wrote the letter that morning while he prepared his horse for the ride to Harlan. It took her an hour, and she rewrote it twice, not from uncertainty, but from the precision of someone who understood that the exact right word in the exact right place was worth the time it took to find. When she read it back to him before he left, he listened with his eyes on her and then said simply, "That'll do it." He rode out at noon. She stayed. She was not sure when she had decided this. She was not sure it had been a decision in the way decisions are usually made. She cleaned the kitchen, and she fed the animals, and she sat at his table and read his Thoreau. And when the light started failing, she put more wood in the stove and started a pot of soup from what was in his larder. And it was not until she was standing at the stove, stirring the soup, that she understood fully that she was not leaving. She was not leaving because she had nowhere more important to be, and because the teaching position in Martha's settlement, which had been the nominal reason for the journey, would still be there when the roads were fully passable. She was not leaving because the work with the documents was not finished, and someone needed to be here to coordinate what came next. She was not leaving because the ranch needed someone who could handle the correspondence with Pratt while Seth handled the on-the-ground work with the county recorder. These were all true. None of them were the reason. The reason was simpler and more frightening, and she was willing to sit with it at least until he came back. He came back at dusk, 2 hours later than expected because the road had indeed been rough. His horse tired and his face cold, but his eyes carrying something new in them. He had filed the complaint. The county recorder, a man named Bill Ashworth who had his own reasons to be glad of complications for Douglas Vane, had accepted the filing and stamped it with the particular satisfaction of a bureaucrat whose conscience had been waiting for a reason to operate. "Ashworth knows 2 other ranchers who have been approached by Vane's men," Seth said, standing at the stove and warming his hands. "He's going to reach out to them quietly." If we can get more than one complaint in the formal record, the pattern becomes very hard to deny. I sent the letter to Pratt this afternoon, said Nora. There's an express rider in Harlan who takes mail to Laramie every Thursday. If Ashworth can get it into that Thursday pouch, it'll reach Pratt by the end of next week. Seth looked at her. You arranged that from here. I have good handwriting and I used your name on the covering note. I hope that's all right. There was a pause. Then slowly, something that was definitively a smile. It changed his face entirely. That smile opened it up in a way that made him look younger and less defended, and exactly like someone she could not picture leaving. It's all right, he said. They ate the soup. He told her more about Vane, the pattern of it, the 3 ranches already absorbed, the families pushed off land they had cleared themselves. She listened, and her anger, the productive kind, built quietly. She told him about the court filings she had seen in Columbus, the names involved on the Eastern investment side, the money that was flowing through it. He listened with his complete attention. You understand what you're carrying, he said at one point. What do you mean? If Vane figures out where this evidence came from, you become a problem he wants to solve. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in Ohio when she made the decision, and she had thought about it on the train west, and she had not allowed herself to think about it during the 11 days of the blizzard because thinking about it would have been paralyzing. I know, she said, and I made the decision before I had any personal stake in the outcome. Now I have more reason than before, not less. He was quiet for a long time. You're staying, he said. It was not a question. If you'll have me, she said. The words had more than one meaning, and they both knew it, and she let them. Seth Reed sat with that for a moment that felt like a much longer moment. Then he said, the spare room isn't furnished. There's a bedroll in the chest under the window. It was not, she recognized, a declaration of anything. It was Seth Reed's way of saying yes without having figured out yet how large the yes was. She accepted it for exactly what it was. Thank you, she said. He nodded and went to see to his horse. The weeks that followed moved with the particular momentum of 2 people who have been brought together by circumstance and are now, by degrees, choosing each other. Seth's ranch hands, Tom Greer and a young man called Eddie Mast, who was 19 and trying hard to become competent, made it back from Harlan 4 days after the blizzard cleared. Their arrival changed the household dynamic in the specific way that a previously private situation becomes slightly official. Tom Greer, who was 47 and had the weathered good sense of a man who had seen many things and made it his policy to be useful rather than judgmental, took one look at the domestic arrangements and wordlessly extended his respect to Nora as though it had been decided, which in his estimation it had. Eddie Mast was 19 and nervous, and addressed her as ma'am, with a fervor that made her suppress a smile every single time. Charles Pratt, the federal inspector in Laramie, responded to Seth's letter with a swiftness that said he had been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation. His reply, which arrived in Harlan 12 days after the letter was sent, was cautious in its formal language and unmistakable in its practical implication. He was opening a preliminary investigation. He needed Seth to provide sworn testimony at his earliest convenience and to bring the original copies of the documents, and he would be in contact about dates. On the morning the letter from Pratt arrived, Seth read it at the table and then looked up and found Nora watching him from across the kitchen, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen before. It was relief, raw and unguarded, the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight alone for so long that the moment it begins to lift he does not quite trust what he is feeling. He said, "You did this." "We did this," she said. He pushed back from the table and crossed the kitchen and stopped directly in front of her, and she tipped her face up to look at him, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he raised his hand and pushed a strand of her hair back from her face with a carefulness that was so deliberate it could not be mistaken for anything accidental. "Nora," he said, just her name, and the way he said it was not a question and not a statement. "Seth," she said back in exactly the same register. He kissed her. It was not an impulsive thing. It was the kiss of a man who had thought about something long enough that, when he finally did it, there was no uncertainty in it. She kissed him back in the way of a woman who has made her decision and is not interested in being tentative about it. When they separated, the morning light was coming through the kitchen window and the stove was ticking, and somewhere outside Eddie Mast was doing something noisy and inexpert with a fence post, and everything was exactly what it had always been and completely different. "I should tell you something," Seth said. "You can tell me anything," she said, and meant it. "When I found that letter this morning," he said, "the thing I felt was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "To be done." She waited. "I've been done before. When I find out a thing about a person that doesn't fit, I've always been able to be done. It's how I've managed." He was looking at the table now and then back at her. "I could not be done. I read it twice looking for the angle that would let me be done, and it wasn't there." "Because I didn't have an angle," she said. "I know. I am not a subtle person, Seth. I know I seem like I might be. I'm not. I brought those documents because I was angry on someone else's behalf, and I stayed because I couldn't make myself leave. And I am telling you this very directly because I have found that being direct saves a great deal of time and heartache." He was looking at her now with that expression she had come to know, the one where he was taking something incompletely. "I appreciate directness," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles with a steadiness that was its own kind of eloquence. She let herself feel it without diminishing it. December came in cold and clear, the mountain air so sharp it felt like breathing crystal, and the ranch settled into the particular rhythm of a winter operation. The cattle were being moved to the lower pastures with their better windbreaks. The hay stores were being carefully managed. Eddie learned to fix a fence post to Tom's satisfaction, which took 3 weeks, and a lot of patient instruction from both Tom and, occasionally, Nora, who had no experience with fence posts, but a talent for explaining exactly what the problem was. Nora wrote to Martha Haynes to explain the delay in her arrival, describing the blizzard and its aftermath with enough detail to be honest and enough discretion to be appropriate. Martha's reply came back in the second week of December and contained, between its cheerful practical paragraphs, the sentence, "From the sound of it, you have found yourself in exactly the right place," which Nora read twice, and then folded into her satchel with the particular smile of someone whose friend knows them very well. She had, in the meantime, taken stock of the teaching situation in the area. There was no functioning school within 12 miles of Seth's ranch, and there were, according to Tom Greer, who had opinions about most things when asked directly, at least 14 children in the surrounding ranch families ranging from age 5 to 14 who were getting sporadic education at best. Nora mentioned this to Seth one evening and watched him think about it. The Territorial School Commission has a provision for establishing a district school if you can document a minimum of 10 enrolled students and provide a qualified teacher, he said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I read the provision a year ago." "I couldn't do anything about it then because I didn't have a teacher." There was a pause. "Seth Reed," she said slowly, "did you read Wyoming Territorial Education Code at some point in the past year?" "I read a lot of things," he said. She stared at him. "Why were you reading Territorial Education Code?" He met her gaze with a complete neutrality. "I read what's relevant." "Why was that relevant?" A long pause. "I don't know," he said, with a tone that suggested he did know, and was choosing this particular moment not to have the larger conversation about it. Nora filed this away with everything else she was filing about Seth Reed, a growing collection of small, truthful things that assembled themselves, piece by piece, into the most complete picture of a person she had ever had. She wrote to the Territorial School Commission in early December and submitted a proposal for a district school. She also, separately, wrote a detailed and extensively footnoted letter to the editor of the Laramie Daily Boomerang regarding the patterns of land fraud in Harlan County, using all of the documentation she and Seth had assembled and attributing the concerns to concerned citizens of the territory, rather than specific names. because the letter to Pratt and the county filing were the formal channels, and this was the channel for public awareness, and she understood the difference. The letter was published on December 19th and created, as she had intended, a noise that was difficult to ignore. Douglas Vane sent a man to Harlan County in the third week of December. The man's name was Fowler, and he was the kind of man that Vane employed specifically, because he was unremarkable in appearance and possessed of a capacity for intimidation that operated below the threshold of what could be easily reported to a sheriff. He came to Seth's gate on a Tuesday morning with the air of someone paying a social call and the eyes of someone taking inventory. Seth met him at the gate alone, because Nora had seen the man coming from the house window and had gone immediately to the barn where Tom and Eddie were working. "Mr. Reed," Fowler said, "Mr. Vane asked me to convey his concern about some recent documents filed with the county recorder. He wondered if you might have any interest in a conversation about your situation." "My situation is fine," Seth said. "Mr. Vane's position is that a man running a difficult operation in difficult times might benefit from a straightforward business arrangement." "Mr. Vane's position," said Seth, "is that of a man who has been under federal preliminary investigation for the past 3 weeks. You can tell him I said so." Fowler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's an aggressive response, Mr. Reed." "It's an accurate one. You're welcome to leave now." Fowler left. But not before he had, as Seth had noticed, looked past him toward the house with the careful, cataloging look of a man identifying variables. That evening Seth told Nora what had been said and watched her listen with that focused, analytical way she had. "He's going to try to find out where the documents came from," she said. "If he traces them back to Ohio and to my connection to Cook. He might. Then we need Pratt to move faster than Vane's ability to make me a problem. I've sent a second letter to Pratt. I've asked for a meeting date in January," she nodded, "and the other 2 ranchers Ashworth mentioned. Both have agreed to submit sworn statements. I'm riding to Tom Hennessy's place tomorrow to collect his." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to go with you." He looked at her. "I know you're thinking that you'd rather keep me clear of any part of this that's visible," she said. "I understand that and I respect it. But I am also your best argument in a meeting with any of these ranchers because I have the paper trail from Ohio and I can explain it in a way that makes the full picture clear. I'm more useful there than I am safe here." He wanted to argue, she could see it. He was a man who would, if left to his instincts, put himself between every danger and the people he cared about and handle things alone from that position. She had spent enough time reading him to understand that this was not condescension. It was a specific and deeply held form of care. It was also, in this case, the wrong call. "You're right," he said. She blinked. She had not expected him to capitulate that quickly. "You're right," he said again. "You're more useful with me than without me. We'll ride together." She thought, not for the first time, that Seth Reed was the most quietly extraordinary person she had ever met. They rode to Tom Hennessy's ranch the next morning in cold, bright air. Nora on a steady bay mare called Ida that Seth had told her she could use with the particular casualness of a man who had long since accepted that what his was also hers without making a production of the fact. Hennessy was a broad, weathered man in his 50s with a wife named Agnes who took one look at Nora and ushered her into the kitchen with the enthusiasm of someone who had been starved of female company. The meeting itself went well. Hennessy's story confirmed the pattern Seth and Nora had identified, the same sequence of a friendly letter, a business meeting, and then increasing pressure when the first approaches were refused. He had received one letter that contained a reference to the condition of his grazing water rights that could only have come from an inside source, suggesting that Vane had access to someone in the county recorder's office. "Ashworth needs to know that," Nora said. "I'll tell him myself," Hennessy said. Agnes Hennessy made coffee that was magnificent and pressed 2 jars of preserved peaches on Nora with the specific insistence of a woman who does not accept refusals. And when they left she held Nora's hands and said, "It's good Seth Reed has someone with sense beside him. He's always been too alone." Nora carried that back down the road with the jars of peaches, and the particular feeling of being seen by a stranger in a way that was both surprising and correct. On the ride home, with the mountains going gold in the afternoon light and the horses moving steadily through the quiet snow, Seth said, "Agnes is right." "About what?" "I've been too alone." Nora looked at him on his horse beside her, and he was looking at the road ahead with the focused expression of a man saying something difficult while doing something else so that the difficult thing has somewhere to go. "You were managing," she said. "I was surviving. They're different things." She thought about that. She thought about Ohio and the schoolroom and the small, efficient life she had built that had been, in retrospect, also more survival than living. "Yes," she said, "they are." He looked at her then, and the afternoon light was on his face, and she thought that she would remember this moment with the particular clarity reserved for things that matter. "I don't want to just survive anymore," he said. "Neither do I," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand and held it, just for a moment, just for the length of a few strides along the road, and then let go, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else was needed. Charles Pratt came to Harlan County in the third week of January 1883. He was a compact, methodical man of about 50, who wore his federal authority like a well-fitted coat, visible but not ostentatious. He came with a clerk and a request to spend 4 days interviewing relevant parties and examining the documents and sworn statements that had been compiled over the previous weeks. Nora met him at Seth's kitchen table on the first day and laid out the evidence in the precise, organized way she had developed over 6 weeks of living with it. She walked him through the Ohio connection, the forged instruments, the pattern across 3 completed fraudulent acquisitions, and the attempted 4th, which was Seth's ranch. She answered his questions without excess and without evasion. Pratt listened with the quality of attention that made him good at his job. At the end of the morning session, he said, "Miss Bailey, how did you come to possess these documents?" She told him. All of it, including Cook, including the school, including the reason she had come west. She did not minimize her own role or its possible complications. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You understand that as the source of key evidence you'll be asked to provide a sworn affidavit." "I've prepared one," she said, and handed it to him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he said, with the closest thing to approval that a man of his professional temperament expressed, "This is very thorough work, Miss Bailey." Seth, seated beside her, said nothing. But his hand found hers under the table and held it. By the end of Pratt's 4 days in Harlan County, he had 4 sworn statements, the full documentary evidence, and enough of a formal record to proceed with an investigation that would, he indicated, be very difficult for Vane to suppress. He was also, after a conversation with Ashworth about the county recorder's office, investigating the potential inside source, which turned out to be a junior clerk named Phelps who had been supplementing his government salary in a way that was going to make him very uncomfortable in the near future. Douglas Vane, Pratt told them on his last evening, was not going to escape this. The preliminary investigation had already been escalated to a formal inquiry. The Eastern Investment Group, Cook's group, was going to come under scrutiny also. It would take time. Federal processes always took time. But the record was made, it was public, and it could not be unmade. Seth shook Pratt's hand at the gate and watched him ride toward Harlan and then stood in the cold evening air for a long moment. Nora came to stand beside him. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he agreed. "The rest takes time, but the immediate threat to the ranch is over." He turned to look at her. The evening was clear and very cold, and the stars were beginning to appear over the mountains in the particular dense profusion of a sky free from any artificial light. "Yes," he said. "It's over." She waited. "Nora," he said. "Seth," she said back, just as she had said it in the kitchen in December. "There's something I've been working toward saying for about 6 weeks," he said. She faced him fully. "Then say it." He looked at her with the complete, unguarded attention that was his specific genius, the thing that made him who he was. "I love you," he said. I've been trying to find a less direct way to say it and I can't. And given what I know of your preferences, I think the direct way is better." She felt the words land in her with the particular impact of something that has been true for a while and is now finally spoken aloud. "I love you too," she said. "I have been in love with you since approximately day 6 when you admitted you'd been reading the Tennyson all along." Something moved across his face, the smile that transformed it, the one that made him look younger and entirely himself. "That's a very specific moment," he said. "I'm a precise person," she said. He laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the kind she suspected he had not produced very often, and it was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard. He pulled her close and she went, without hesitation, into the particular solidity of him, his arms around her and his chin resting against her hair and the mountain air cold around them both and everything, for this moment, exactly right. They were married in March of 1883 in the little white church in Harlan, Wyoming territory, on a Saturday afternoon when the snow had begun in earnest to retreat from the lower elevations, and the first tentative green was appearing in the grass of the lower pastures. The church held everyone who came, which was more people than Seth had expected. Ranchers and their families from a 10-mile radius had come, not out of obligation, but out of the genuine goodwill that accumulates toward a man who has stood his ground, and a woman who came from nowhere with the truth in her satchel. Martha Haynes came from her settlement with her husband James, a broad-shouldered, cheerful man who shook Seth's hand with the exuberance of a man, welcoming him to a family he had not known he was joining, and who told Nora that she was the best thing to happen to this corner of Wyoming since the railroad came through, which made Nora laugh and Seth nod with a sincerity that surprised even him. Agnes Hennessy sat in the front pew and cried with the productive enthusiasm of a woman who considers weddings a proper occasion for tears. Tom Hennessy sat beside her with the stoic expression of a man who is also moved, but has decided not to demonstrate it publicly. Tom Greer stood in the back in his good shirt with his arms crossed, and his face in the particular composed expression of a man who has been proved right about something and is keeping the victory quiet. Eddie Mass stood beside him and looked at the proceedings with the expression of someone experiencing something he had not previously understood was possible. The Reverend, a lean, serious man named Whitfield, conducted the ceremony with efficiency and genuine warmth. When he reached the part about speaking now or forever holding one's peace, there was a silence so complete that the horses tied outside could be heard shifting. Seth Reed took Nora Bailey's hands at the altar and looked at her with the look that she had, by this point, catalogued as his most private and most real expression, the one that said everything he was usually too careful to say out loud. And she looked back at him with the same completeness and said her vows in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the church. He said his vows in the low, resonant voice that she had first heard on the night she knocked on his door in the blizzard, and the sound of it saying "I will" and "I do," and for the rest of my living days settled in her chest like something that had always been there, and had just found its right place. They came back to the ranch that evening, just the two of them, because Tom and Eddie had been sent to Harlan for the night with money for dinner at the hotel and strict instructions to stay there. The house had been cleaned, the fire laid, and someone, she suspected Agnes Hennessy, had left a pot of something good on the stove and a jar of wildflowers on the table that were technically dried from the fall but had been arranged with obvious care. They stood together in the kitchen in the last of the evening light, and Nora looked at the table and the stove and the worn braided rug and the shelf of books, and felt the house differently than she had felt it in November when she first came through the door in the storm. Then it had been a stranger's house, spare and private, a place that had accommodated her out of necessity. Now it was a home she was part of, had been helping to build for months without quite naming it, and the naming was finished now and the building could be fully conscious. "Happy?" Seth asked. She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe, which she now knew was where he processed things, and his expression was quiet and open and waiting. "Entirely," she said. He held out his hand and she took it and he drew her in. That night the mountains were visible through the bedroom window as they always were on clear nights, the peaks that she had watched every day for months now acquiring new dimension in the dark. She lay beside Seth and listened to the specific quality of his quiet, which she had learned was not absence but presence, and felt the peculiar completeness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "I've been thinking about the school," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but contained amusement. "It's our wedding night," he said. "I know, I'm still thinking about the school. The commission approved the charter. I have 14 enrolled students. I need a building." "I know," he said. "There's a piece of flat ground between the road and the east pasture that isn't being used." "I know," he said. She propped herself on her elbow and looked at him. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting for the appropriate moment to tell her. "Seth Reed. Nora Reed," he said. The first time he had said her married name, and the sound of it was something she had not prepared for. She sat with it for a moment, feeling it settle. "Did you already ask Tom and Eddie to start clearing the ground?" she said. "I did not," he said. "I asked them to order the lumber." She pressed her face against his shoulder so he would not immediately see that she was smiling in a way that made her feel somewhat ridiculous. "You are," she said against his shirt, "a deeply thoughtful man." His arm came around her. "You did mention it 4 times in the past 2 weeks. I mentioned it casually." "You mentioned it with your Tennyson face," he said. She looked up. "I have a Tennyson face." "You do. It's the one that means you've already decided something is important, but you're giving the other person a chance to arrive at it independently." She stared at him. "How long have you known I had a Tennyson face?" "Since day 3, he said. She pulled the blanket up and settled back against him, and he held her with the particular quality of permanence that she had come to understand as one of Seth Reed's defining characteristics. He did not do things provisionally. When he committed with his whole body and his whole self, and there was no part of him standing apart from it. She fell asleep to the sound of the ranch at night, the far-off sound of cattle and the wind in the fence lines, and the ticking of the stove cooling, and she thought, at the very edge of sleep, that the blizzard had been a dark and terrifying thing, and also the best thing that had ever happened to her. The spring of 1883 moved quickly and productively. The federal investigation into Douglas Vane was proceeding with the unhurried but unstoppable quality of government process when the evidence is solid. A letter from Pratt in April confirmed that Vane had been formally indicted on 4 counts of fraud involving land instruments, and that his Eastern investment partners, including Gerald Cook, were under separate scrutiny from federal investigators in Ohio. Pratt's letter thanked Seth for his cooperation and added, in a handwritten postscript, "Your wife's documentation was invaluable. She has a gift for assembling a case." Nora read the postscript twice and felt a specific satisfaction she decided to simply accept without diminishing it. The school building went up in April, a sound and serviceable structure of good timber on the flat ground east of the ranch road, with 4 windows for light and a proper iron stove and a small bell mounted above the door. Tom Greer did most of the carpentry himself, with Eddie as his earnest and increasingly competent assistant. Seth had built the desk platforms himself, precise and even, in the evenings after the ranch work was done. Nora opened the school on the first Monday of May, with 14 students ranging from 5 to 13 years old. They came on horses and in wagons and on foot, bundled in their best clothes, with the contained excitement of children who have been told that something significant is happening and have chosen to believe it. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them and felt the clean, deep satisfaction of being exactly where her particular combination of abilities was needed. She taught arithmetic, reading, history, and letters, and she taught them in the way she had always taught, precisely and patiently, and with the firm conviction that every child in the room was capable of more than they currently believed. By the end of the first month, 2 of her older students were reading at a level that surprised their parents. By the end of the second month, the youngest one, a boy of 5 named Henry Greer, who was Tom Greer's grandnephew, and who had arrived on the first day with the expression of someone expecting to be bored, had discovered that numbers were interesting, and was adding 2-digit sums with a concentration that left him temporarily unreachable by ordinary conversation. Tom Greer received a report of this development with the carefully neutral expression of a man profoundly moved, who had decided to continue being neutral about it. The ranch had a good summer. Seth's cattle count, with careful management and the supplemental feed issue resolved with the discovery of Nora's ledger error and the subsequent renegotiation of supplier terms, came back to its previous level and then exceeded it. The hay yield was better than the previous year. Eddie Mast, who had arrived as a 19-year-old uncertain of most things, had by midsummer become competent at every primary ranch task and had begun to have opinions about cattle management that were mostly right. Seth began giving him more responsibility with a gradual increase that was clearly calibrated, and which Eddie received with the particular combination of pride and seriousness that indicated he understood what was being offered. Nora and Seth had developed, over the months since the blizzard, the specific language of a couple who have built something together from uncertain beginnings. They argued about some things, the school budget and the approach to the eastern cattle buyer who came in July, and the correct temperature for bread baking, with the productive quality of 2 people who respect each other's intelligence and are not afraid of disagreement. They agreed about most things, the large things, with the ease of 2 people whose fundamental values have the same architecture. They were better together than either was separately, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say it constantly because it was evident in every day's operation. In October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Nora had packed her trunks in Columbus and set out for a new life she had not yet been able to picture, she sat across from Seth at the kitchen table in the evening and told him she was expecting a child. He went very still. She watched him, trying to read him the way she had been reading him for a year. He was looking at the table and then at his hands and then at her, and when he finally looked at her, the expression on his face was the one she had never fully learned to predict, the deep one, the one that was not guarded or managed or filtered. "When?" he said. "Late spring, April or May, I think." He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You're all right." "I'm perfectly well," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed them to his face in a gesture so uncharacteristically open that she felt it like a physical thing in the center of her chest. "Good," he said, with a quietness that contained everything he did not have the words for. She leaned across the table and kissed him, and he kissed her back. And outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming autumn was moving toward winter again, and the mountains were turning purple in the dusk, and the stove was going, and the school bell was visible from where they sat, and the life they had built was absolutely, unmistakably real. Their son was born in early May of 1884, on a morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were just coming into leaf, and the air smelled of new grass and cold water. They named him James, after Martha Haynes's husband, who had become one of Seth's closest friends over the intervening months, and the name was a choice that reflected something Seth had been building toward saying about what friendship and community meant to him now, in a way they had not before. Martha Haynes came the day after the birth, and held the baby with the competence of a woman who had 3 children of her own, and the satisfaction of someone whose instincts have been vindicated. She told Nora that he had his father's brow and his mother's expression, which meant he was going to be both stubborn and right about most things, and this seemed correct enough that both Nora and Seth had nothing to add to it. Tom Greer looked at the baby from the doorway with his usual contained expression and said that he was a good size and that they had done well. Eddie Mast held him once, very carefully, with the expression of someone handling something extraordinarily valuable and fragile, and said, "He's really something, isn't he, Mrs. Reed?" with a sincerity that made the room collectively fond of him. James Reed grew the way children grow in good circumstances, with the characteristic speed that catches you by surprise, from the small and new into the present and recognizable. He had, as Martha had predicted, his mother's expression and his father's habit of taking things in completely before responding, which was a combination that in a small child manifested as an unusually watchful quality that adults invariably found compelling. The school had, by the autumn of 1884, grown to 22 students, which required Nora to reorganize her teaching approach significantly and petition the Territorial Commission for a second school building, or at minimum an extension. She was involved in 2 separate territory-level conversations about frontier education funding and had become, not by design, but by the particular momentum of doing work people needed done, someone whose letters to Cheyenne got responses. The federal case against Douglas Vane concluded in the winter of 1884. He was convicted on 3 of the 4 counts, fined a substantial amount, and the land acquisitions made through fraud were ordered subject to review, with an avenue established for the dispossessed families to file for restitution. Gerald Cook in Ohio settled a separate civil matter related to the Eastern Investment Group's activities and lost, in the process, a significant portion of the position and financial standing he had used to destroy Nora's career 2 years earlier. Pratt wrote to inform them. Nora read the letter at the kitchen table on a January morning with James on her hip and Seth across from her with his coffee, and when she finished reading it, she folded it with a care that was also a kind of release. "It's finished," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Does it feel different, the ranch being fully yours?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table and then at the window that faced the pasture where his cattle were moving in the pale winter light. "It was always mine," he said, "but now it's not a fight." She understood this completely. The difference between a thing you are defending and a thing you simply have. "Good," she said. He reached across and touched James's hand, and the baby wrapped his fist around Seth's finger with the automatic, uncomplicated grip of complete trust, and Seth's face did the thing it always did when he looked at his son, the thing that was unguarded in the same way the night he had told her he loved her had been unguarded, open and real, and not managed at all. Nora watched him and felt the fullness of it, this life in this kitchen in this country that she had arrived at in the dark and the cold and the terror of a blizzard, and had stayed for and built into something that was hers in every dimension. She had come with her documents and her anger and her need for a new start. She had found, in a man who had needed someone capable of finding him, a love that was exact and complete and entirely worth every difficult and uncertain mile. By 1885, the school had a second teacher, a young woman from Iowa named Clara Marsh, who had come west for the same reasons Nora had, and whom Nora had met at a territorial education conference in Cheyenne, and hired on the spot because she recognized in her the same combination of precision and genuine care that made a person good at teaching children. Clara Marsh was 23 and had red hair and strong opinions about mathematics curriculum, and she and Nora disagreed productively about pedagogy approximately 3 times a week, which both of them found stimulating and which made the school better. Seth had, over the 2 years since the wedding, gradually and without announcement, extended the ranch's operation to include a partnership with Tom Hennessy's family for a shared cattle drive operation, which reduced both operations' costs and increased their leverage with the buyers in Cheyenne. It was Tom Greer who had suggested this, with the understated efficiency of a man who had been watching ranching economics for 30 years and knew what made operations viable. And Seth had spent a week thinking about it, and then executed it with the characteristic thoroughness that was his signature. Eddie Mast had, by the autumn of 1885, become sufficiently competent and trusted that Seth was already in the process of training him to manage the day-to-day operation independently. A process that Eddie understood was preparation for real responsibility, and which he was approaching with a seriousness that had entirely replaced the nervous young man who had appeared in Tom Greer's wake 3 years earlier. Nora was expecting their second child in the winter of 1885, a fact she told Seth on an October evening while they were sitting on the porch in the last of the year's warmth watching James, now 18 months old, conduct a serious investigation of a beetle on the porch boards. Seth looked at her and then at James and then at the mountains and then back at her, and the expression was the same one as before, the deep and open one, and she held it for a moment before he said anything. "You're well," he said. "Very well," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and James, apparently satisfied with the beetle, abandoned it, and made his unsteady way across the porch and grabbed Seth's leg with both hands and looked up at them with the expression he used when he was about to demand something. "Up," said James. Seth reached down and picked him up with the unhesitating ease of a man entirely comfortable with fatherhood, and the boy settled against his father's shoulder with the bonelessness of a child completely secure, and Seth's chin rested against his son's head and his arm was around his wife, and the evening air was cooling toward the cold it would become, and the mountains were going the deep purple of late autumn. This was a life. Not the life Nora had left Ohio for, not the precise picture she had constructed when she was angry and purposeful and alone. Something better than that. Something she could not have planned because you cannot plan for the specific shape of a person who fits exactly into the space in your life you did not know was shaped for them. Their daughter was born in February of 1886, a February that was cold in the deep, permanent way of Wyoming winters but not a blizzard, and the birth was uncomplicated, and the baby was loud and clearly opinionated from the first minutes of her life, which Seth took as entirely appropriate, and which made Tom Greer, receiving the news from Eddie in the yard, produce a sound that was unambiguously a laugh. They named her Clara, after the woman Seth had loved and lost in Colorado, and the naming was Nora's idea, offered quietly and without pressure one evening when they were discussing names, and Seth had been quiet for a long time after she said it, and then had said yes with a simple finality that told her she had understood him correctly. Baby Clara had Nora's gray eyes and Seth's dark hair, and an expression that combined both their characteristic intensities in a way that made the people who met her either slightly awed or very amused. She was not a tranquil baby. She had strong feelings about most things and expressed them efficiently and at volume. James, now approaching 2, regarded his sister with the mixture of fascination and wariness that would characterize their relationship for years, already understanding that this person was someone to be taken seriously. The ranch in the spring of 1886 was a different thing than it had been in November of 1882. It was larger and better organized and managed with the particular efficiency of an operation that has 2 people thinking about it instead of 1. The house had been expanded the previous summer, a new room added to the west side for the growing family, built with the same care as the original structure. The barn had been rebuilt properly after the blizzard damage of the first year, sturdier and better insulated. The school was a proper institution now, with 28 enrolled students and a reputation in the county that had brought Nora 2 separate invitations to speak at territorial education meetings. But the thing that mattered, the true and central thing, was the specific and daily reality of what existed between Seth Reed and Nora Bailey Reed, which was not a romance novel or a legend or a story someone told, but a living thing, built from practical love and the willingness to be known, from the 11 days of a blizzard and every day since. From documents in a satchel and a poem about a woman who looked at the world directly and a letter behind a flour sack, and a man in a doorway processing things, and a woman who talked too much when confined and never once became someone other than exactly who she was. On an evening in April of 1886, Seth stood at the same window where he had stood on the morning the snow cleared, the window that looked out over the yard toward the barn. Nora was inside behind him in the kitchen, and he could hear her moving, the particular sequence of her sounds that he had long since memorized, the set of the stove, the shifting of the pot, the way she hummed a few bars of something when she was thinking and forgot she was doing it. James was in the corner of the kitchen playing a game involving two wooden horses and a piece of rope that was apparently a river. Baby Clara was in the small wooden cradle he had built last fall, making the small, intense sounds of a baby deciding whether or not to require attention. He looked at the yard and the mountains and the school building visible from where he stood, the bell on its post in the afternoon light. He thought about the morning he had found the letter. He thought about standing at this window, unable to picture her gone. He still could not picture it. Not the absence of her at the stove, not the absence of her voice when she was explaining something she found interesting, not the absence of her hand in his at the kitchen table, not the absence of the way she looked when she was right about something and was being gracious about the fact, not the absence of her beside him at night or at the breakfast table or at the county recorder's office or at the school door on the first day of every term. He could not picture any morning without her in it. He had been afraid of needing people. He had sealed himself behind the loss of Clara and behind the hardness of his upbringing and behind the practical, contained life of a man working land alone, and he had told himself for years that the sealed state was safer than the open one. Nora had not broken through the seal. She had simply shown up in a blizzard, walked into his kitchen, made his coffee, argued about stew, found errors in his ledger, read his Tennyson, written him a letter that told the truth when telling the truth was the hardest thing to do, and over 11 days and every day after, made it entirely impossible for him to maintain the position that sealed was better. He was not sealed anymore. He was open, fully and without reservation to this specific woman and this specific life, and the openness was not the weakness he had feared. It was the most solid thing he had ever built. He turned from the window. "Nora," he said. From the kitchen the humming stopped. "Yes. Come here a moment." A small pause, the sound of the pot being set to a slower position, and then she appeared in the doorway that had once been his thinking place, and was now simply the place where the kitchen opened into the rest of the house. She had flour on her hands and her hair was coming loose from its pins the way it always did by late afternoon, and she was looking at him with her particular expression of interested readiness. "What is it?" she said. He crossed to her. He took her flour-dusted hands in his and held them. "Nothing," he said. "I just needed to look at you." She looked at him with those gray eyes that were, as her mother had always said, the color of rain about to happen, and now he knew what that meant, that it was not a storm coming but something necessary, something that made things grow. "You're being unexpectedly sentimental," she said. "You're an unexpectedly good reason for it," he said. She tilted her face up and kissed him, quick and warm, with the flour still on her hands and James's wooden horses clicking on the floor and baby Clara, deciding that she did, after all, require attention, and outside the evening mountains going the deep gold of a sky that had been purely itself all day, and was now simply finishing well. Seth Reed held his wife's hands in the doorway of his kitchen and felt, with a completeness he would not have believed 3 years ago, that the life around him was exactly the life he was supposed to be living. The blizzard had sealed them in. The snow had cleared. And he had spent every day since then incapable of picturing a morning without her, which was, it turned out, not a vulnerability. It was the best possible evidence that he had finally, after a great deal of work and a great many difficult miles and one stubborn, brilliant, direct, impossible woman who knocked on his door in the dark, built exactly the right thing. He had built a home, and she was in it. And every morning she woke beside him was a morning. He was glad to be the man who had opened his door to the storm.